It's fair to say that the Abraham Accords have completely changed the face of the Middle East and North Africa. The normalization of ties between Israel and several of its Arab neighbors, including the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, have shifted the paradigm in the region. What was once unimaginable is now reality, and Jewish-Muslim relations will likely never be the same. Even just last summer, who would have thought that tens of thousands of Israeli tourists would soon be flocking to the beaches and shopping malls of Dubai? Well, to share their insights on these rapid geopolitical developments, we have with us today Morocco's ambassador to the United Nations, Omar Hilale, and former top U.S. diplomat Ambassador Dennis Ross. But first, we're going to turn the floor over to Jason Guberman, the executive director of the American Sephardi Foundation, for a few words. Jason?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So the American Sephardi Federation is a founding partner and integral organization within the Center for Jewish History. Our mission is to preserve, promote, and perpetuate the history, traditions, and rich Mosaic culture of the greater Sephardic communities. The ASF is a library, an archive, historical, and cultural organization. We represent the Sephardic voice in Jewish communal and diplomatic affairs, including as members of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations and World Jewish Congress. In the past year, the Combat Anti-Semitism movement has exceeded our expectations in every way as it has grown to ever more effectively fight anti-Semitism. We are proud to have been one of the first organizations to partner with CAM and to be joined by our friends such as Association of Mimuna in Morocco and MANI, the Moroccan Americans in New York, who were the first Muslim-majority organization in America to sign the Combat Anti-Semitism Pledge. Mimuna has recently signed a memorandum of understanding with the U.S. Department of State that canonizes the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism with its crucial examples. Last summer, with CAM and the ASF honored the Muslim World League's Secretary General, Sheikh Dr. Mohammed Al Isa, with the first CAM ASF award for a Muslim leader who has courageously and creatively countered anti-Semitism, as well as fought against all forms of hate, bigotry, and fanaticism. I give the foregoing background to set the stage for some thoughts on the current moment that we are in. Muslim-Jewish relations begin with the friendship of Rabbi Muhayrik and the Prophet Muhammad, and the rabbi's martyrdom in the service of the Prophet's cause. The fact that this is probably the first time many of our viewers have ever heard of Rabbi Muhayrik's name, no less have any idea of his accomplishments, represents the shroud of Jahiliyyah, or ignorance, that has descended on the region in recent decades and is just now beginning to clear thanks to the visionary and moral leadership of the Kingdom of Morocco, of the United Arab Emirates, of the Kingdom of Bahrain, and Sudan. This is a new era, but one that is rooted in history. The Middle East is the heartland of Jewish history, the home to our prophets, our historical and our holy sites. Greater Sephardic Jews were once one of a plethora of peoples who made Cairo, Tyre, Aleppo, and Baghdad bustling hubs for trade and innovation. The Abraham Accords, and again, this is going to sound very strange for people who have this stereotype of the region. The Abraham Accords represent a reassertion of classical Middle Eastern values of moderation, pluralism, and future-mindedness by recognizing the rightful place of Israel in the region and the rightful history of Jews in the region. Today, we are looking at the possibility of an era in which Muslims and Jews, as in centuries past, will once again be able to channel their considerable talents and resources into projects that will benefit all of humanity. At the same time, there is a struggle for the heart and soul of the Middle East going on right now. There is the pluralist past and the possibility of a pluralist future, and in between, there was the force of Islamists and Arab National Socialists who conspired to eliminate minorities and destroy that pluralist possibility. Today, we're faced with Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, the Iranian regime, and many other challenges in the region that could conspire again to prevent peace, prosperity, and progress. It is our hope, working together with our very good friends in the region, to stand with them, those who have the courage to oppose anti-Semitism and to oppose these forces together to achieve that future that's in the offing. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. I now have the honor of introducing the Moroccan ambassador to the United Nations, Omar Hilali, and former top U.S. diplomat, Ambassador Dennis Ross. So, ambassadors, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. And first, Ambassador Hilali, I'd like to ask you, Morocco and Israel have long had behind-the-scenes contacts. Why was it important to now bring those relations out into the open and officially normalize ties?
Before answering your question, I would like to stress one very important point, is that the Moroccan Jewish community is an ancient community, and their presence dates back over 2,500 years on the time of the Carthaginian state. And that the domination of the Romans in the 17th century, Jews settled in Morocco alongside with Moroccan Amazigh. They adopted their language and lived harmoniously with each other since then. So the existence of Jewish people is a part of our history, part of our roots. Jewish people is not a minority in Morocco. They are just considered as Moroccans. You ask now why we are not working behind the scene. I can assure you that we have been working and getting contact with Jewish people in Israel, with officials also. I would like to remind that Morocco was involved and was the initiator of the peace process between Egypt and Israel. So politicians and Morocco played very important role when there was no contact between Arab states and Israel in the Middle East. And we have so many people visiting Morocco from Israel, and Israelis visiting Morocco. And we are very proud to have this very important community of almost 1 million. It's the second community in Israel who are keeping strongly their links with Morocco and are building very strong bridges also between Israel and Morocco. The exchange and the contribution of Israeli technology in agriculture is very known and very appreciated for decades. So talking about normalization between Morocco and Israel, for me, the term normalization is not correct. We can say reconnecting or relinking, because the link have never been broken. The difference is that there was maybe a formal relationship, but there was a lot of trust, a lot of confidence, because Morocco from the beginning was acting and working thanks to the King Hassan II and now the present King Mohammed VI, genuinely and sincerely for the peace between Arabs, Palestinians, and Israelis. And the fact that we are reopening our embassy or our representation now that is another talking about our commitments. So for us, it's just continuity of what the kind of relationship that we have. People trust us to be the honest go between Arab states and Israel. And Israel also was cooperating with Morocco in so many fields. And when I'm talking about multilateral, it means that Morocco have been all the time having very fruitful, very engaged, and very honest relationship with Israel. And for us, it's not complex, because we believe in peace, we believe in our imperative of living together, and we believe that peace cannot be in our region without having all the people living and coexisting and accepting each other in the same area. And that's the objective and the vision of His Majesty the King by renewing this or reviving this relationship between Morocco and Israel.
All right, thank you for that answer. Now, Ambassador Ross, my first question for you is similar to what I asked the Moroccan ambassador, but on a broader scale. Why now? Why all of a sudden are all of these Arab countries going public with their relations with Israel?
Well, I think there's a number of factors, but let's put it in a certain context. There has been a relationship that has been developing between a number of Arab states and Israel for some period of time. The truth is, below the radar screen, it was already emerging in the 1990s, once you had the Oslo process and once you had prior to that, the multilateral working groups. once the PLO, for example, was prepared to deal with Israel, many Arab states, not counting Morocco, because as the ambassador said, Morocco had this long-standing relationship. Morocco played this fundamental role in terms of bringing Egypt and Israel together. But many other Arab states began to have a connection for the first time. Now, over time, the preoccupation with common views of security threats began to change things. There's no question that if you take a look at the reality of strategic threat perceptions as it related to specifically Iran, as it related to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, for some of the states, especially in the Gulf, as it relates to how they perceive the Muslim Brotherhood, Israel was seen as a natural strategic partner. But that produced, in most cases, cooperation below the table. What we've seen, and this is really the heart of your question, why is it being raised above the table now? Now, one of the precipitating events, ironically, in the case of the UAE, is that the UAE made a decision that they wanted to continue to pursue the process of normalization, which in their case began more than a decade ago. They were already publicizing certain parts of it. They allowed the Israelis to establish a diplomatic office in Abu Dhabi in 2015 in the International Renewable Energy Agency. They were going, prior to COVID, they were going to allow the Israelis to have their own pavilion at Expo 2020 prior to the time of formal normalization. The precipitating move in their case was they made a decision that they wanted to prevent Israel from annexing the territories allotted to it under the Trump peace plan. And so the Emiratis came to the Trump administration and said, look, we can give you a win. We can give you the first peace treaty since the Jordan peace treaty with Israel in 1994. But in return for that, we'll do full normalization. We'll do a peace agreement. We'll do a peace treaty, but no annexation. And we want you to address some of the security concerns we have to get weapons that we haven't had for we've been denied because of the American commitment to Israel's qualitative military edge. So the Trump administration made a decision to go for that. Once the UAE kind of crossed that threshold, it certainly opened the way for others, at least psychologically. But I think it also it reflected something else. It didn't mean that the Palestinian cause was forgotten, but it did mean that for most Arab states, for most Arab leaderships, their priority was pursuing their own national interests. The Palestinian issue might still be there, but it was a lower priority, number one. And number two, it was also a signal that there was less fear that the Palestinians, if they rejected it, could mobilize opposition and potentially threats to any regime that was to normalize with Israel. So what you're seeing is not a disappearance of the Palestinian cause, because after all, in the case of the UAE, they conditioned normalization on no annexation. But what they did by in a sense, breaking this threshold for others was to send the message that we're going to pursue our national interests first. And I think what we've seen is other Arab leaders have done the same. And I suspect over time, we will see other Arab countries follow suit.
Now, Ambassador Hilali, I'd like to turn back to you. There's a long, rich Jewish history in Morocco. You mentioned this. Do you think that the Abraham Accords will lead to greater tolerance for Jews throughout the Middle East and North Africa? And while establishing diplomatic ties is, of course, a great first step toward a more peaceful future, how do you build people-to-people ties and eliminate long-standing hostility that still exists on the streets?
I think to build people-to-people links, we need to start with our own country. Signing an agreement have not been enough in the past, because that's what we used to call cold peace with Israel. What we need is very warm peace, very fruitful, very beneficial to both sides. And as Ambassador Ross just said, that there is the national interest of every country. And every country, of course, now is looking to see which kind of dividend the relation with Israel will bring to its people, to its country, to its security. But beside that, what is needed is education, educating people about coexistence. More than coexistence, because personally, I don't think that coexistence is enough. What we need is accepting the other, accepting its difference, accepting its religion, its belief, and also building on the history. I think among all the countries in the region, Morocco is the one who have the most deep-rooted history with Jewish people. And we are now starting, no, not now, I mean, we have been starting since many years to revive this history, to educate our children, and to show that Jewish people is part of our components, is part of our DNA. And to educate people, we need to not only to talk about history, but also to talk about their contribution, the contribution of the Jewish people to the civilization, the culture, and development of Morocco. That's why His Majesty the King Mohammed VI took 3 or 4 very important and very strong and symbolic decision, which show that Morocco is very attached to its legacy. First of all, renaming the streets and the places in different cities of Morocco with their origin name, Jewish name. And this is taking our present to our past and taking bridging the link. The second was to inaugurate what His Majesty called the House of Memory. And I think our friend Jason was there when this inauguration was in Sawera. It's like a museum where we discover the history, the legacy, and the common history that Muslims, Moroccans, and Jewish have on the land of Morocco. The third is now in the curricula, in the universities and in the schools. Before there was silence about what is the Shoah, what is the Holocaust, who is responsible, how we can prevent this to happen. And now we are educating our children from the primary school. What's the tragedy of Shoah, why it happens, and how we can behave to prevent it, and how our religion is part of the whole religions of the world. And finally, I was amazed just this week. I saw that the Minister of Education inaugurates the first courses of Jewish language to Hebrew language to the children in the primary school. So you can see it's not only in Morocco there is Jewish schools, Jewish courts and justice, but now we are teaching the Jewish Hebrew language to our very young children, 7 years, 6 years. This is, I think, the seeds for having better Middle East, better North Africa, with peace, with culture of accepting the other, and also cooperating for a better future, because all our leaders now, they have this obligation to build better future for the coming generation. And this, our children deserve to live in peace, in harmony, and in coexistence in the coming years.
All right. Now, Ambassador Ross, from your storied diplomatic career, you're deeply familiar with the Arab world. Do you think that anti-Semitism, which has existed for centuries, is an intractable problem in the region, or is it something that can be mitigated through developments such as the Abraham Accords?
Well, first I would say, obviously, anti-Semitism doesn't just exist in the Middle East. And it is something that obviously has been always identified, I think, with xenophobia, oftentimes identified with populist leaders. So it's a scourge that needs to be dealt with internationally. But you're right, it has been embedded in the Middle East. And I do think what you were just hearing Ambassador Hilali talk about, this represents a very important way of really trying to eradicate all of its vestiges. Education is critical. The fact of educating in Hebrew is, I think, a sign of acknowledgement and respect. I think the Abraham Accords for sure can build on this. I think what we see, and Jason referred to this, what we see, the moves made by the Muslim World League, this is very important. The more we see an effort to educate on tolerance, the more we see an emphasis on respecting minority rights, the more you see the notion of pluralism being introduced and made more of a reality within the Middle East, the more you'll be able to see real headway made against anti-Semitism. The fact that it exists internationally, not just in the Middle East, means it's not going to be so simple to eradicate it in one place. It needs to be part of a mission, an international mission, to constantly discredit those who continue to purvey it. But yes, I do think the Abraham Accords represent, because what's built into their premise is this acceptance of the faiths and how the faiths need to live together. So I do think it's an important platform for that.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank all of you for your time. It was truly enlightening to hear about these developments, which will likely continue to make headlines for the foreseeable future.